So if your home feels like it was generated by a ChatGPT prompt for a nice apartment, I'm going to tell you why. It's not that you're not creative, it's that you're making the same mistakes so many people make, which are so subtle you've probably never named them out loud. So in this video, I'm going to finally put a name to the 4 default settings that quietly make your home forgettable. And if you stick around until the end, I'll show you exactly how to fix them. So let's be honest, a lot of rooms feel boring, but I don't think it's because anything is fundamentally wrong with them. Most of the time, it's just because everything in the room looks the same. I'll walk into a space and it's like rectangular sofa, rectangular coffee table, rectangular side table. And so every major piece is the same outline, just scaled up or down. And when that happens, the room just flattens out. There's nothing for your eye to grab onto, and so it slides right over everything. And honestly, I get why this happens, because I think we all default to safe shapes. Rectangular sofas feel normal, and rectangular art feels like the safe choice. And individually, none of those are bad at all. But when everything in a room follows those same familiar forms, nothing really stands out, and your brain just kind of goes on autopilot. And so for me, it's like listening to a song where every instrument is playing the same note at the same volume the entire time. There's nothing pulling you in, so after a while, you stop paying attention. And that's what boring homes feel like to me. They're filled with the same safe shapes, and nothing ever interrupts that pattern. And so the space ends up feeling more like a showroom than somewhere that someone actually lives. I mean, imagine an apartment building where all the apartments look the same. Not exactly inspiring, right? Well, in the same way, a room full of lookalike shapes has no wow factor to catch your eye. It just feels flat. But one thing I've learned is that shape is one of the first things we register in a room, even if we're not consciously thinking about it. A curved wingback chair, a pendant light with an unusual geometry, those pieces don't have to be expensive or overly dramatic. They stand out simply because they introduce a form you don't expect. But if a room is wall-to-wall rectangles, your eyes just glide over everything. There's no pause, no tension, no reason to look twice. And I see this all the time in bedrooms. The headboard's a rectangle, the nightstands are rectangles, the dresser's a rectangle, and of course, the bed and the rug beneath it are rectangles. And so everything works technically, but the room just feels like a giant game of Tetris with interlocking rectangles sliding together. Functional, yes, but not interesting. And when that's the case, I don't think the solution is adding more stuff. Most of the time, it's about changing the balance of what's already there. So the way I approach this is really simple. I stop thinking about furniture as furniture and start thinking about outlines. I'll take a quick inventory of the room and ignore brands and styles completely. If most of what I'm seeing is straight, boxy, and angular, that's my cue to introduce something curved. So something like a curved ottoman, a round stool, even a ceramic vase can change how the room feels. It doesn't need to be a statement piece, it just needs to break the rhythm, because one contrasting shape is usually enough to give the eye a place to land. And if a space already leans heavily into soft, rounded forms, then I do the opposite. I'll anchor it with something crisp and angular, so that rectangular table, a linear console, or some squared off artwork. Otherwise, the room can start to feel a little too soft, almost to the point of shapelessness. So contrast works both ways. It's not curves versus straight lines, it's letting each one make the other feel right. But I'm also paying attention to things like height, because if everything in a room sits at roughly the same level, like a low sofa, low coffee table, and low side tables, again, the whole space just feels flat. But you can break that up by mixing in taller elements, like a floor lamp or a bookshelf, and then balancing them with lower pieces like the bench, the ottoman, or a low console. Because even small changes in height give the room layers instead of everything sitting on the same visual plane. But probably the biggest thing I've learned is that variety doesn't come from adding more pieces. It comes from choosing pieces that play different visual roles. And once I started thinking in terms of shapes instead of just individual items, rooms became so much easier to fix. And that's usually the moment a space stops feeling generic. Not because it got louder, but because the eye finally has something different to respond to. So a friend of mine recently moved into a new apartment, and I stopped by to pay him a visit. And he had his living room set up in the same way that a lot of us do. Couch pushed up against one wall, and TV pushed up against the opposite wall. Clean, logical, and technically fine. But standing in the room, again, it just felt so flat. And I know a lot of people feel this way about their own living rooms. They look okay in photos, but they don't really pull you in. They feel more like a two-dimensional stage set than a room you actually want to spend time in. And the reason for that is simple. simple. When everything gets pushed to the edges of a room, all the depth disappears. And that's because our eyes don't experience rooms as flat images. We experience them by moving through them. So when everything sits on the same plane, lined up neatly against the walls, the space starts to feel like a backdrop instead of a real environment. And even if the furniture itself is great, nothing draws you in because there's nothing happening in front of or behind anything else. And this usually comes from good intentions. Especially in smaller spaces, people push furniture against the walls because they think it'll make the room feel bigger. And on a floor plan, it looks tidy and efficient. But in real life, it does the opposite. You end up with a dead zone in the middle of the room and all the life pressed against the perimeter. So the room looks organized, but it feels empty. And this is where depth really matters, because when I think about depth in a room, I think about layers.
No! Layers!
Now, I'm not talking about ogres, so pipe down, Shrek. I'm talking about the kind of layers we know from photography, where you have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. When an image has all three of these elements, it feels rich and interesting, but when it's missing one or two of them, it becomes much less interesting. And rooms work the same way. Take a living room where the coffee table sits in the middle of the room, the sofa is pulled slightly off the wall behind it, and the back wall has some eye-catching shelves and artwork. Your eye will naturally move through the room without you even thinking about it. Coffee table first, then sofa, then the wall. Foreground, middle ground, background. 3 distinct layers. But compare that to a room where the coffee table is pushed right up against the couch is pushed right up against the wall, and there's a huge empty space in front of everything. In that setup, there's basically no foreground or middle ground. Everything collapses into the background. You see the entire room instantly, and your eye has nowhere to go. That's why it feels flat. And so this is why rooms with depth feel warmer and more inviting, even when they're small, because they don't reveal themselves all at once. There's a subtle sense of progression as your eye moves through the space, and that's what makes the room feel alive. So practically speaking, this comes down to how things relate to each other. So I'll usually stand in a few different spots in a room so I can see it from multiple different angles. If I can clearly see everything in the room in a single glance, that's usually a sign the room is too flat, because if your eye can take in everything immediately, there's nothing left to discover. But shifting just a single thing can completely change that. So if you've got a chair sitting next to a floor lamp, I'll pull the chair slightly forward so the lamp sits just behind it. Now you're not seeing two separate objects anymore. You're seeing one in front of the other. So your eye has to move chair, lamp, wall, and that movement is depth. And I'll do the same thing with plants. Instead of parking a plant in an empty corner just to fill space, I'll move it so it slightly overlaps something else, the edge of a sofa, console, or a chair. Not enough to be annoying, just enough so it creates a foreground with the rest of the room sitting behind it. And even consoles don't have to live perfectly flush against the wall. Pulling one forward a few inches and placing art or a mirror, or even just the wall itself behind it, creates a subtle gap. And your eye recognizes that distance immediately, and it understands there's space between different layers, not just objects sitting on the same line. So when depth is working for you, you feel it right away, because your eye doesn't stop, it moves. You notice the coffee table, then the sofa behind it, and then the wall beyond. So the room feels active and lived in. And most of the time, getting there isn't about buying more furniture. It's just about letting the room exist in 3 dimensions instead of 1. So up to this point, I've talked about 2 really common problems I see: rooms filled with the same shapes, and rooms that have no depth. But sometimes neither of those is the real issue. I'll walk into a space that's laid out well, the furniture is placed properly, and the proportions make sense, but it still feels boring. And a lot of the time, it's because everything is made from the same material in the same finish. And this happens way more than people realize. So think about walking into a room where the floors are wood, the furniture is wood, and even the decor is wood. On paper, it's unified, but again, nothing catches your eye. There's no contrast, and our eyes and also our sense of touch crave variety. But when everything feels the same, your brain has nothing to latch onto, so the space just feels dull. But I know what some of you are thinking. You love the log cabin look, and I get it. I do too. But even a log cabin doesn't have to be only logs. You're allowed to bring in some other materials, and that contrast between materials is actually what makes the wood feel good in the first place. Now, the most common way I see people fall into this trap is by buying matching furniture sets, and that makes sense. They're sold as as convenient packages, and sticking to one finish feels like a safe way to make sure everything goes together. Problem is that too much unity is just as bad as none at all, because when your table, sofa, and picture frames are all the same wood tone, your home starts to feel like a furniture showroom. And if every cushion, curtain, and piece of upholstery is done in the same fabric, then everything just blends together into one visual mass. So I like to think of materials as having personalities. Wood brings warmth and natural texture, metal adds a bit of sharpness and edge, glass feels light and reflective, and fabric brings that softness. But when you only use one material, you're only getting one note of that sensory orchestra, and the result is a kind of visual monotony. And you see this so much in modern kitchens where the cabinets, the counters, and the backsplash will all be done in the same glossy white. So it does look clean, but it can also feel sterile. But the moment you add in some matte black hardware or a couple of wooden shelves, the space starts to change. It's not a huge move, but now the materials are playing off of each other a bit, and the room starts to feel like it has some character. Now, a lot of people worry that mixing materials will make their space feel chaotic, and it can if it's done randomly, but when it's done thoughtfully, variety actually makes a room feel more high-end. And that's why designers lean so heavily into contrast. Something smooth next to something rough, something matte next to something shiny, and warm materials balanced with cooler ones, because it's this exact interplay that gives a room so much character. But if you're not sure where to start, balancing hard and soft is the easiest entry point, because rooms full of wood, glass, and metal can feel pretty rigid if there's nothing there to soften them. But adding in fabrics in the form of cushions, curtains, or a throw blanket just takes the edge off all those hard lines. And on the flip side, rooms that lean heavily into soft elements, with plush sofas, flowing curtains, and pillows everywhere, they can start to feel a little formless. So in those cases, bringing in something harder, like a metal coffee table or a ceramic lamp, just gives the space some structure and keeps it from feeling too soft. And even within fabrics, variety still matters, because a smooth cotton sofa feels so much richer once it's paired with a chunky knit or a velvet pillow, because the contrast makes each texture more noticeable. And this is where natural materials really shine. Wicker, rattan, jute, stone, clay, they all add texture without making a space feel busy. For example, a woven basket in a room full of clean lined furniture adds an organic note that breaks up that sameness. A jute rug under a stone coffee table and a marble tray on a wooden dresser do the same thing. These materials work because they add that contrast while still feeling neutral and easy to live with. And I should also mention that different finishes reflect light differently. Glossy surfaces bounce the light around and feel energetic. Matte finishes absorb light and feel heavier and calmer. And rougher materials create tiny shadows, which adds visual depth even when the color stays the same. And that's why rooms with a mix of materials feel more alive throughout the day, because as the light changes, the room subtly changes with it. So nothing is fighting for your attention, but nothing disappears either. So up to this point, everything we've talked about has been very visual. Shapes, depth, materials. All the stuff you can almost diagnose from a photo. And if you get those right, your space will feel noticeably better. But here's the thing I've noticed. Even when all of that is working, a room can still feel a little off. Not unfinished or like it needs more furniture, just empty in a harder to define way. Like, it looks good, but it doesn't really say anything. And that's when it stops being a design problem and starts being a personality problem. I ran into this a while back when I visited a coworker's apartment, and everything there was done really well. The furniture was sleek, the art was coordinated, and the place looked polished. So on paper, it was a great space. But after I left, I realized something was missing. The apartment didn't tell me anything about her. No personal photos, no hints of hobbies or interests, and nothing that broke the mold. So honestly, the place could have belonged to anyone. And that's the thing. Her space wasn't bad. It was just completely impersonal. It felt more like a hotel suite than a home. And when a home doesn't give you any sense of the person who lives there, it just has no soul. And I see this happen when people try really hard to make a room look right. Maybe they're copying a look from Pinterest, maybe they bought a full matching furniture set, or maybe they just tucked their personal items away because they don't quite fit the look. So everything is coordinated, but the person living there gets edited out of the equation, and the result is a room that looks finished but feels oddly cold. And maybe you've even fallen into this trap yourself. In trying to make your living room look polished and magazine cuisine ready, you might have tucked away things that actually meant something to you, like a quirky ceramic piece given to you by a family member or that random collection of souvenirs, because they didn't quite fit the vibe you thought you were supposed to have. So your room looked put together, but it stopped feeling personal. But what's interesting is what happens when those pieces come back out. The room doesn't suddenly feel messy, it feels warmer, more relaxed, and those small details give the space an identity, and they make it easier for both you and anyone else to feel comfortable in it. Because if you think about rooms you've loved spending time in, they almost always have something specific on display. Travel photos, a collection, a color choice that felt personal. Those things pull you in because they have stories behind them. So a room without any of that might look nice, but there's nothing to connect with. It's the difference between a stock photo and a candid snapshot. But to be clear, adding personality doesn't mean cluttering every surface or filling your room with random stuff. It's about choosing a few things that actually matter and letting them show up. If you love travel, that might be a framed photo from a trip or a memento you held onto. If music or film is a big part of your life, maybe it's vinyl records on the wall, a poster you genuinely love, or an instrument left out instead of hidden away. And color matters too, especially when it's personal. If there's a color that makes you feel good, it deserves a place in your home, even if it's just subtly included in a cushion, a throw blanket, or a small piece of art. And speaking of art, artwork and photos don't need to be big or expensive to matter. It could be a piece by a local artist you like, or a few family photos in some simple frames, because those add character to your home in a way no store-bought setup ever can. And to be honest, sentimental pieces is where a lot of homes fall short, because the things that actually mean something often end up in drawers or boxes because they don't feel designer enough. But just picking a few of those and giving them a proper spot, like a handmade vase, a vintage clock, or something passed down through your family, it instantly makes your space feel more personal. And those pieces always become conversation starters without you even trying. And I think it also helps to let at least one thing in the room be unapologetically you, even if it stands out a bit. Maybe it's an old floral chair in an otherwise modern space, or maybe it's a quiet nod to something that connects you with your childhood. It's those quirks that people remember, and they keep your home from feeling anonymous. Because once more of you shows up in your space, it starts feeling like home. And the funny part is, the things people worry will ruin the design usually end up being the most charming parts, because trends come and go, but the stuff you love and the stories attached to it stick around, and a space that reflects who you are will always feel more alive. So why does any of this actually matter when you're trying to fix a boring home? Because most of the time, a boring home isn't a missing something problem, it's an awareness problem. Because a lot of people think some homes just naturally feel good and others don't, like it's taste or money or some design talent you either have or you don't. But what really separates spaces that feel interesting from ones that feel flat is actually way simpler than that. It's not about having better stuff, it's about having clearer reasons. So what I want you to take away from this isn't a checklist, it's a shift in how you approach your space. Because most people treat their home like a shopping problem. Something feels off, so the instinct is to add. New chair, new rug, new art, and every purchase feels like it might be the thing that finally fixes it. But most boring homes aren't under-furnished, they're under-edited. Because what makes a room feel good isn't how much is in it, it's how clearly each thing knows why it's there. And when a space feels boring, it's usually because too many pieces are doing the same job and too many choices are playing it safe. But once you start thinking this way, the goal shifts. You're not trying to make your home perfect, you're trying to make it legible, so you can walk into a room and understand what kind of life actually happens there. That's why fixing a boring home almost never starts with buying something new. It starts with asking better questions. What's doing the heavy lifting in this room versus what's just filling space? And when you answer those honestly, the solution gets a whole lot simpler. Sometimes it's removing an item, sometimes it's nudging something 6 inches forward, and sometimes it's just letting that one slightly imperfect thing stay instead of replacing it with something better. And this is also why expensive homes aren't automatically interesting, and why small apartments aren't automatically boring, because interest comes from clarity, from contrast, from decisions you deliberately made instead of going with the default. So if there's one real takeaway from this video, I think it's this: boring isn't a life sentence. It's the result of default choices stacking up. But once you stop defaulting, once you start editing instead of adding, you can change how your space feels without turning your life upside down. So if this way of thinking about your home clicks for you, send this video to someone whose home could use a little bit more personality. And if you want to keep developing this skill, not of buying more, but of seeing better, check the link in the description. And now that you know why your home feels boring, the next step is to actually fix it. So watch this video next where I go even deeper into how to take a flat, forgettable room and turn it into a space that finally feels like yours.